automobiles and kitchen appliances, but it was things, right? Capital was either money or gold or things. But now today we know capital is human capital. It is the quality of the people in a society that makes the difference for the growth of that society in the years to come. And Americans have always known this. Right? We've had the greatest educational system in the world for 2 centuries. We had an elementary school system before anybody else in the 19th century, and we had secondary schools in the early part of the 20th century, and we grew our higher educational system faster than anybody else. And because we did all of that, we became the world's greatest economic power. It was human capital. We had some other advantages as well, but the human capital that we created in this society, a nation of immigrants, it was our collective human capital that explains more than anything else the great triumphs that this country has accomplished over the generations. So, a lot of Americans were on that stand in Vancouver at the last Winter Olympics. And we won more medals than any other country in the world. These are the countries that were also medal winners. The ones up there on the screen. There's Germany and Canada and Norway and Austria. They all won plenty of medals too. But we were first, right? We were first. Let's be proud of it. But where are we in science as compared to these other medal-winning countries? That's where we are. According to the PISA test, administered to 15-year-olds by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development to countries across the globe, this is how we compare to our competitors, those who can stand on the Olympic stage along with us. This is where we stand in science, and this is where we stand in mathematics. Way down at the bottom. Italy's below us. We're ahead of Italy. Just want you to know that. In math, we're ahead of the Italians. But we can't say too much more than that. So it's an urgent situation that we have. Now, I want to talk about 32. Last night we sang Happy Birthday. I'm not going to ask you to sing Happy Birthday again to Michael. We did that last night. But I do want to let you know that he's 32 years of age. 32. Now, Michael, that's when water turns to ice. Now, this is a science lesson we have here. The answer, this is digital education. We put the answer right up there on the screen. Water turns to ice. You can freeze over at 32. And so it's really interesting that the United States ranked number 32 in the percentage of students proficient in mathematics among the nations that took the PISA test, number 32. And the percentage of students who are proficient in math, as determined by our government, is 32%. 32%. This is really a remarkable number. Now, if you compare us to other countries, Shanghai, it's not all of China, admittedly, it's metropolitan China, but 75% of the kids in Shanghai are proficient in math, and in Singapore it's 63%, Korea 58%. The Canadians to the north, 49%. Now, people say, well, this isn't a random sample. This isn't all the kids in Canada, is it? It is. It's a representative sample of the students in Canada, as in all these other countries, being compared to the same kind of sampling frame in the United States. So 49%. Now we say, okay, so yeah, but we have so many minorities, so many disadvantaged students, but if you just take the white students in the United States, only 42% are proficient in math. So the Canadians, all Canadians of any race, color, or creed, are ahead of just the white. And that's not a fair comparison. I don't think that's the right comparison. I'm just using it to dramatize the point. You can't excuse this away. So there are a lot of countries who do a lot better than we do. So Jay Green at the University of Arkansas has come up with this idea of looking at every district in the country. You can go to his website. If you go to educationx.org, you can find this data for every school district in the country, including your own school district. Okay, how does that school district compare to countries around the world. And if you do that for places like Beverly Hills, California, you'll find that they're about at the international average. And the same is true in Montgomery County, Maryland, and Fairfax, Virginia, and Evanston, Illinois, and many of the other apparently exclusive suburbs that people want to send their children to. But even those places are not turning out kids that are any more than average. Now, Wakanda, Kansas. Anybody from Wakanda, Kansas? No. But Wakanda, Kansas is real world-class place. There the students are performing at the highest level. There's the KIPP school that is, there's the charter school in North Carolina that is. So there are some places in the United States where you can find performance at the highest level, but there are not very many of them. And they're surprisingly in different places than you would expect. So some of you will say, I don't believe in tests. These tests are meaningless. I don't think that's true. I think the countries where the kids score well at age 15 are the countries that look very prosperous in years to come and continue to grow. But so let's take graduation rates. That yellow line up there is the graduation rate. The red line is the enrollment rate. We have lots of kids in high school. Almost all of our kids go to high school, but only 70% are graduated. 70% are graduated in 4 years' time. And how do we compare to other countries in that regard? The red bar is the international average of the OECD countries, the industrial countries of the world. That's the red bar. We're the green bar. We're below average in graduation rates from high school. This is a pretty serious matter. This is not a minor consideration. So why is this important? It's important because, according to economists who worked on this, if we can move our performance up to the level of the Canadians, and even better to move it up to the level of the Koreans, we could improve our economic growth rate by 30 to 50%, which would be worth about $1 trillion a year, which would pay off our national deficit. Not bad, would it? It would be sort of a nice thing to be able to pull that off, if we could do it. And it can be done. Our neighbors are doing it. We could make our system more productive than it is today. So this is an urgent matter. And it's important to realize that it's not just a matter of spending more, because we have been spending more. This is the trend line in expenditures in the United States per pupil. This is taking inflation. This is not an inflation chart. Inflation's not in this chart. This is adjusted for inflation, yet we have been spending more and more dollars. We spend $12,000 per pupil. And part of that is because we do have smaller class sizes. This is the number of teachers per pupil, and you can see that the number of teachers for every given number of students has been increasing, and therefore class size has been falling. If you actually look at the number of professionals per 100 students, educational professionals in our K-12 educational system since 1960, that number has actually, over the decades, steadily increased, so that there's twice as many today as there was back then. So we have a lot more people working in this industry. We're not getting any more product out of it. And it's not because teachers are particularly well paid. Now everybody's better paid than they used to be. If you look at this little green line, you'll see that wages in the United States, this is the average wage of all workers in the United States, that's gone up fairly steadily over the decades. And if you look at the people who have a college degree, that red line, they are going up at an even faster rate. So education is more valuable today than ever before. That's what the difference between that red and that green line tells us. Education is more valuable on the job than ever before. And the yellow line shows us what's happened to teacher salaries. And teacher salaries track the average wage in the country. So teachers are as well paid as they ever have been relative to other workers, but they're no better paid. But they're being paid more, just because everybody's being paid more, and that's why expenditures have to go up. We have more people, we're paying them more, and yet we now have a financial crisis that everybody is worrying about, and the chance of getting more money to pay for more education is going to be more and more challenging as we move forward. So what are we going to do about it? Well, let me put forth this idea of co-production. Co-production is, how am I doing for time, Michael? I got another few minutes? Okay. So, co-production is what it was invented here in Indiana. At least the concept was by Eleanor Ostrom at Indiana University. She got a Nobel Prize for this and other things. And it's a really interesting concept that she applied to sort of public services. Okay, the police need the neighbors to help identify potential criminals, otherwise the police can't do their job. The people who clean the streets have to have help. We have to put our stuff in the trash cans, otherwise they can't do their job. So co-production is cooperation between paid labor and unpaid labor. And the more you can get unpaid labor to do part of the job, the more productive you're going to become. Now, businesses have figured this out. You know, Walmart has figured this out. They got us wandering around that big store, collecting all this junk in their big carts, and bringing it home and putting it on our shelves so they don't have to put it on their shelves. So this way they make more money, right? Because they get us, the unpaid labor, to do the work that the person at the store used to do themselves. And the banks are really good at this. They got us going to these ATM machines. And you know, we now have to get our own bank statements online. And they've come up with all kinds of schemes to get the unpaid labor to do the work that was once done by paid labor. And the airlines are good at this too. And so industry has learned the secret of co-production, get unpaid labor to do the work of paid labor. Now, if you think about it, what is the industry in which unpaid labor is the most important of all? And of course, it's education. Who's the most important person in education? Is it the teacher, the paid worker? The teachers are really, really important. We know as compared to anything else about a school, what really counts is the quality of the teaching. So a teacher is really, really important. But how about the mother? Mothers are even more important. And even dads are sort of important. And grandparents, right? Grandparents are okay too. They might help out. But it's none of the above. The most important person is the student. And Ted Sizer said this back in 1984. He was the dean of the Harvard School of Education. He said, the student is a crucial actor. Whether we adults like it or not, he or she decides what's being purveyed. So yes, the student has to be engaged in his or her education. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. You have to have co-production. You can't dump it into their heads. They have to learn it, and they have to want to learn it, and they want to have to be engaged. And this is where digital learning comes in. There's no more important findings, said Ted Sizer, than after he had studied a bunch of high schools. There's no more important than the fact that students as students are docile, compliant, and without initiative. And why is that? Why is that? I think it's because, as Daniel Willingham has put it, working on problems that are of the right level of difficulty is rewarding, but working on problems that are too easy or too difficult is unpleasant. And lots of students find it unpleasant because they're sitting in classrooms where 1/3 of the students are bored because they had already learned the material, another third are confused because they have yet to learn the material that they need to learn before they can learn what's being taught by the teacher that day. So you have a setting in which docility and compliance and indolence is encouraged. Necessarily so. It's very hard to get around this. So what we need is teaching to the price point. I learned this when I went to Pebble Beach and spoke to a group of hospitality design people who were trying to sell faucets to people, right? And you could have gold faucets, but nobody can afford the gold faucets. Or you could have really, you know, sort of metal faucets that don't look very good. And if you try to sell them to people, they think you're from Walmart, so they think you're a cheap outfit. So you have to find their price point. You have to find where people are willing to put their money before you can start pitching a product to them. And this is true in the automobile industry to a fault. You've got zillions of cars out there, each trying to find a particular price point for every customer. Well, that's the way it is with students. We have to personalize their education to reach the price. Even in medicine, they're now trying to say, we need personalized medicine. We can't just have medicine on average, we have to personalize it. Well, this has got to be even more true in education. We have to find each individual's learning point. Now, I think we've got to realize that digital learning, the way it's going to be, is not where it is today. And I think that's what we have to thank Michael Horn for and his colleague Clay Christensen for their seminal idea, which was that we are in the transistor pocket radio stage of digital learning. We haven't yet produced that product that's going to get better and better over time and is going to take over the industry in the same way that transistors took over from the vacuum tube industry. That world is changing very rapidly for us, just as it did for the TV and radio industry 50 years ago. So there's absolutely no reason why we can't have three-dimensional presentation of curricular materials in the near-time future. In fact, it's available today. It's possible. Well, let me just put it this way. I took biology course in high school, and I was a faithful student. I actually did read the textbook. I did look at the drawing of the frog, which showed where his heart and his lungs and his stomach and his backbone and all that stuff was. And I thought, boy, do I know the frog inside and out. So then came dissection of frog day. So it wasn't a thing like this video or this picture here, right? No, I didn't have any white gloves. That poor froggy died for nothing. You know, it was just worthless, right? That whole experience. It was a squishy mess. So now kids can have their avatar dissect the frog's avatar again and again and again, and no amphibians will be killed. And this is actually being done today in medical school. You know, avatars of doctors are taking cadaver avatars and dissecting them and learning how to become doctors. That's what's going on in medical school. So this is something which, if it can be done for the elite today, can be done for everybody in the not too distant future. But you have to have continuous feedback to the learner and to the teacher, and to the parent, and this is what I think is one of the genius ideas that the Khan Academy has come up with. He's not the only one, of course, but this whole idea that the teacher will have continuous feedback as to exactly where the learner is at each and every point in time so that you can keep teaching to that price point. That is part of what we have. Now, there's going to be some controversies as we move forward, and the one that I would like to sort of highlight today is the one between those who believe in blended learning, that the way in which digital learning must be done as we move forward is in the classroom. And there's a lot to be said for that. There's a lot to be said for the fact that in a classroom setting, the teacher can act as the coach, the material comes in online in the most sophisticated way, getting better and better with the passage of time, and the students in the classroom help one another under the direction of the teachers. You have a lot of social interaction, engagement among peers. There can't be anything that one can say badly about this, especially if you have a good teacher, a good coach in that classroom. But not everybody is going to find it the easiest to learn that way, and then you're not going to be able to teach every course in that way. And there's a lot to be said as well for offering digital learning online. At any path, any pace, how does this go, Julie? Any time, any pace, any path, any place. So yeah, as the Florida Virtual School model puts it, it greatly enlarges the space available for learning. And there are going to be some kids who are going to learn better this way. And it may be that new technologies can come online faster this way. And it may be that you can get around all the obstacles of the current infrastructure and all the resistance that's built into the brick and mortar school system that we have now. if you can do the runaround. And at the very least, you need the competition between these two sectors to drive everybody forward. So why not provide both options? I just want to sort of make a point in passing. The public's ready for this. This is a question that asks whether or not you would support taking a course online for high school credit and goes on your transcript. The blue is the support. 50% of the public supported. This is from our survey that we've been doing every year over the last 3 years. There's 25% in opposition. That's the red, the green. These people haven't made up their mind yet. So the support is double the opposition to this among the general public. And what's interesting is the teachers like the idea too. This is not a big sale to the teaching community. They can see this. And parents are even more excited about it. So yes, there is public support. So what must be done to succeed? Digital learning needs to be transparent. It's got to be, we all have to be able to see what's going up online, and it's got to be a lot different from the teacher closing the door and nobody knows what's going on in that classroom. And we need to have standards that make it clear what it is that we expect, and that's where the Common Core standards come into play. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this area, but we're now beginning to put that system into place what digital learning desperately needs. And we need accountability. And we need accountability for students, and we need to have evidence that in fact they are learning. We can't have Atlanta scandals. Atlanta scandals did not destroy the brick and mortar school. It had been around for 2 centuries. No scandal is going to kill it, but digital learning is a precious baby. It can die in the crib. And these kinds of, we have to prepare the infrastructure now to make sure these kinds of scandals don't happen to the digital learning world. And we have to have a system that's flexible, we have to have accountability, but at the same time we have to have ways of constantly improving it. We don't want to sort of get ourselves into a procrastinating bed, and we have to have a policy system that encourages competition among all the providers, because that's the only way in which we're going to have a constantly improving, dynamic, digital learning system for the next generation of learners. So it's urgent, it needs to be done, it can be done, the people to do it are in this room. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. It's always an honor to be on stage with you. You were obviously an early mentor to Clay and I as we were writing Disrupting Class, and the first work from that was published in your journal, Education Next. So always an honor to share a stage with you as well. I want to thank all of you last night for, I received several surprises on my birthday yesterday. One of them was Tom Vander Ark and everyone leading a rousing singing of happy birthday, so thank you. Paul, incidentally, and I had been debating whether online learning could teach singing or not. And after last night, we concluded conclusively that you guys passed the test, so thank you. What I wanted to do, just really briefly, Susan had suggested that it'd be helpful. We had done some work on this market map with the New Schools Venture Fund, and Anthony came of Education Elements. And just as a transition to what I'm going to do, which is get to interview Paul over the next few minutes, was just quickly give a flavor of a lot of the innovation we're seeing in the space right now, and sort of this effort we did to provide sort of a concierge of services for people just coming to the field, to just really quickly get up to speed with the different areas of technology and how they're growing and so forth. So what I've done here is just quickly stolen a few screenshots from this work that you can find at the New Schools Venture Fund website. It's free up there, and it has an interactive map that I'll show you in a little bit. But when Anthony, Kim, and I, who's here, sort of dove into this work, we basically tried to categorize about 300 or so different organizations that were selling basically products or services or providing products or services in the K-12 public education world. And as we dove into it, we sort of saw that there were these 4 categories. Curricula, which is obviously digital content, including online courses, games, tutoring, specialized providers, and the like. There's instructional systems. These are things like learning management systems, assessment systems, grade books, the social learning systems that are a new category that's pretty interesting. There's data systems that a lot of you are familiar with, student information systems, analytic and reporting systems, and so forth. And then talent management world of online professional development, observation tools, and human resource systems. And within each of these 4 categories, we then broke the world further, and obviously categorizing is challenging. We had to make a bunch of decisions along the way, and we also knew that as soon as we published this, it would be out of date the very next day. Turned out Pearson had some ideas for connections education here. Plato, who I believe is here, just had another acquisition, so the world's always changing. But we had these broad categories of curricula ranging from online courses that just are providing the content itself, games, educational games. Intervention core refers to reading and math, supplemental curriculum. Online instruction refers to the content plus the teacher plus the learning management systems and so forth, the TPAC framework that Susan has shown during this conference, but in the past as well. Specialized content is really referring to everything that's not reading and math in the supplemental space. So everything from science to autism solutions and so forth. Test prep, tutoring, and digital textbooks are probably fairly self-explanatory. Instructional systems, you can see this. I won't go through this entire thing, but you can see the range of stuff. And then this is what the market map looks like. So each of these dots represents a different company, just to give a flavor for investors, entrepreneurs, all of you, schools who are trying to implement blended learning, offer online learning solutions, sort of the universe of a lot of the stuff out there where we're seeing a lot of activity. You can see, for example, there's tons of offerings in the intervention core area around reading and math solutions, for example. Lots of things in assessment systems and learning management systems and so forth. And then we did a few more cuts at it just to say who are these different players and so forth. This is just one of them that I thought I'd show, which was we tried to do a cut it by the stage of the company. That is, was it just a company that was just getting off the ground and being incubated? Was it an early stage company that was just getting investment dollars? We have another slide that talks about the difference between nonprofits, for-profits, and governmental organizations in the space. Were they growth companies, established, flat declining, or had they just been acquired? And this gives you a little bit of a feel for it. What's interesting is, for example, in the intervention core area there, you see it's actually a pretty healthy marketplace of a lot of investments going into startups and some interesting, more established players as well. The online instruction courses have been where the disruptive players obviously have lived over the last decade, and there's really interesting activity there that gives you a feel for it. What I thought I would do also then is just give you a quick feel for what the interactive market map on the New School Venture Fund website looks like. And basically what you would see this when you jumped on the site, and you could click into curricula, for example, through the power of just controlling it by mind. Now, thank you to the people in the back doing this. You can then see the market map, and say you wanted to dive into the online instruction area there. You can see the different players that we had tried to categorize. We know this is imperfect, obviously, so you have additional ones that we've missed. Send an email to New Schools Venture Fund and they'll update it. But if you click on Advanced Academics there, that first one, for example, then there's a quick profile of who the organization is and so forth, and then you can always click back on the main button there to head back to the map itself. So I thought I would show this just as a tool and a resource for all of you to continue building on, but something that you can really grab onto, let other people know. If it helps you just quickly navigate what's a really bewildering world with lots of innovation going on, which allows me to come back to Paul. And actually, as I'm starting to ask him questions, what I'd encourage you to do, you all have some white slips, I believe, at your tables. And if you have questions as well for Paul, feel free to just jot them down and then raise your hand, and there'll be people roving around, and they'll start collecting them, and in a few minutes, they'll start bringing them up to me, and I'll be able to sort through them and ask them to Paul. Paul, the first question that I'm interested in, took a lot of notes during your presentation. 2 pages worth, as you can see. The first question I'm interested in is you talked about the need and imperative for innovation given what's happening in the international landscape and how we're comparing now to all of those countries and so forth on these different measures of performance. What are lessons you think that we can learn from some of those countries in the United States that we should be thinking about that maybe they've done? Are there particular things that you think are important to hang our hats on and think through as we're starting to do this innovation strategy as well here?
Well, we have an article in Education Next that just went up online yesterday, I think, which actually does exactly that. So let me point to that for anybody who wants to turn their computer on. But if I were to pick any one thing, I think it would be, let's have a clear set of standards that we expect students to attain if they're going to graduate from high school. There was some confusion at a conference we held on this as to whether or not the Finnish people do this, because there are some people who say, well, there are no standards. There are no examinations at the end of high school. But that's really not the case. They have a very well-developed examination system. It's just not done in a sort of a nationally advertised way, but everybody knows what's expected of them in this high-performing country. And the Koreans clearly have an examination system. It's extremely demanding. And everybody knows that if they don't do well in that examination, they're not going to be, a lot of options are going to be foreclosed to them in the future. And this raises expectations all the way up and down the line. What I find very interesting about my home state of Massachusetts is that in 2000, we put into place in the state a state test that's only at the 10th grade level, but Massachusetts has the highest standards of any state in the country, so it's at a fairly high level of expectation for student performance. And that has had an incredible effect on student performance since that was put into place. Massachusetts has moved to #1 among all the states. And I'm not saying this just to brag about my home state, but to simply say that if you put into place an examination system or even if you set clear standards, to me it's the biggest problem in the high school today is that students don't know what's expected of them. And I think it's very logical for a clear set of standards being put into place at the same time that we put digital learning into place. Because digital learning cannot succeed unless the people who are producing the services know what it is that's expected of them. So to me, these are congruent developments.
That's really helpful. What you mentioned on the slide also about the Common Core standards, just to drill into it one more step. You said, these are coming along. You've been noted as a skeptic for much of your academic career in certain areas, being able to ask some probing questions that others aren't maybe willing to ask, which has won you friends and then enemies of those friends at various times. What do you think about, what are the big question marks you have right now as we're developing those Common Core standards? What worries you? What do you think we need to pay attention to?
Well, it's easy to set the standards. It's more challenging to figure out exactly how you're going to assess whether or not students are going to meet those standards. You have, what's the level of accomplishment that you're going to expect? What level of proficiency is expected of students? Currently, when we have, under No Child Left Behind, we have every state setting its own standards, and there's enormous variation from one state to the next. And it's a total confusion as a result. So, yeah, there's a lot of potential for that happening all over again, and that's really what we need to avoid second time around.
Perfect. Let me go to one question here from the audience. They ask you, the support for online learning or digital learning actually declined. It appeared in your survey from 2010 to 2011. Why do you think this happened, and do the problems in online higher ed perhaps play a part in that, and how should we be thinking about those issues?
That's a good question. I have been confused about that because the public support for online learning jumped 10 percentage points between 2009 and 2010, and I said to myself, my gosh, this is really taking off. A 10 percentage point increase in public support for anything is just unheard of in any 1 year, moment in time. And so then it slipped back 5 percentage points, so now it's right in the middle between those first two observations. So, I think in the end, I'm just sort of saying, it looks to me like it's more or less hasn't changed a lot over this period of time. You still have half the population supporting it. The one thing that I didn't show on the screen that's sort of interesting is that we oversampled well-to-do people, people in the highest 10% income bracket. I thought they would be on the cutting edge, that they would embrace innovation, that they would love the new technology, that they would be the first to embrace. No, that's where the opposition is. The opposition is coming from the upper end. The people who read the New York Times have decided. The people who are the educated, well-to-do are thinking that technology is not such a good thing. Let's keep it in. So for them to be the Luddites in the system was pretty surprising.
It's interesting. I mean, and it makes some sense given that they've obviously done pretty well with the system as it is for their children, I would think.
Yes, the other side of the coin is the minorities are even more supportive than anybody else. So if you talk to African Americans, Hispanics, they like the idea, but that's probably because they're not getting a good education in the brick and mortar school.
One of our interesting observations has been in Los Altos, California, close to where I am, where we're not at the top of the nation like you are in Massachusetts. In a pretty well-to-do middle-class, upper-middle-class neighborhood in Los Altos, they've adopted the Khan Academy and gone to a blended learning model in math. And the parents there love it, and one of the things that we've been thinking is, this is really important actually to get this demographic and not forget about serving this end for that reason that you just mentioned, but also to show that this is really for everyone and to improve everyone's attainment, which goes back to that international point I think that you were saying as well, which is you can slice the data any way you want. Even if you take the upper performing parts of the United States, we still don't compare particularly well to the international assessments and so forth.
Right, and I think that's the message to communicate back to this affluent segment of the population is don't think your children are getting such a great education. It could be a lot better. And digital learning might be the way to do it. So, but I think it is an irony that the very segment of the population that I thought would be driving the change, it may not be there. The support may not be there, or it needs to be developed. At the very least, it needs to be developed. That constituency has to be shown that online learning actually works, that the new technologies are actually more effective than the typical teacher. They're never going to be better than the best teacher. I don't think we should ever claim that. Maybe at some time in the future when we really have a system that we can't even imagine today. But we have to assume that not everybody can have the best teacher every year, and most of us have had pretty bad teachers in some years. And it can really improve the quality of instruction for those who don't have the very best teachers.
It's interesting, actually. There was some research done. BYU Idaho moved much of its curriculum to online learning, and they did some research on it, and they showed the sort of a bell curve of ratings of classes and performance of classes and so forth from the traditional face-to-face to the online. When they first went, the average of the, on a 6-point scale, the average of the face-to-face was something like 5.6 or something like that. Huge variation, huge variation. And then they went online and they just sort of at first had their instructors with very little curriculum design and just throw it online. And so it was a 4.7 or something like that. And I said, maybe we should talk to some people who've been doing online learning for a while and brought some specialists in and some experts, curriculum experts in design, and people that could really make it look good. And they shifted that curve such that the average actually exceeded what the face-to-face was, but the curve was really narrow. So it basically said you cannot replicate the best professors online, and so you can't get Paul Peterson maybe in all his glory from Harvard, but your chances of getting a bad experience went down precipitously, and you basically were very clustered in a higher average point than the face-to-face, which was interesting.
Well, I sort of think I'm probably well below average. I'm teaching this course online. I'm doing the blended learning model, folks. I'm flipping the classroom for the first time in my life this year. I'm a learner, and so it's really been a sort of a humbling experience because I feel like I understand this transistor pocket radio stage much better now than I did when I first read your essay on that, Michael. But basically, what I did is first of all, Harvard wouldn't give me any technical support, so I had to speak to a brick wall I give all my lectures to this brick wall, which was a challenge in and of itself. And you know, then all I had were these little PowerPoints, none of these very dynamic use of YouTubes and videos and all of that, which would take too much of my time all summer long. I didn't want to spend my summer doing all of that, so I did it the lazy man's way. And so, but the students, so anyhow, that's what the students have to watch at night. And then they're supposed to come to class, and then we talk about that. They're supposed to do their reading as well, and so then we talk about it in the classroom. And I don't think they think too much of my lectures. I think they think they're sort of boring and dull, but they do like to talk. So the classroom sessions are going pretty well, and so I think there's just tremendous room for improvement. This is what I really learned. There's tremendous room for improvement, and I'm desperately waiting for student evaluations to come in, and I hope they're not too horrible.
I'm sure they won't be, but so I want to go to some questions here. We're getting a lot in, which is good. The one that I see come up all the time is, isn't standardized testing contrary to personalized learning? You talked about the need for assessments. How do you think about that?
Well, yes, personalized learning, but you do have to have some objective as to what you're learning towards. Now, somebody will say, okay, what kind of an assessment are you going to do? And I think there's a lot to be thought through on that front, and I don't have any definite word. I'm not an expert on the testing front. And I think there's a lot, we don't have to necessarily use the test that we have now. The one thing I don't like is the SAT. The SAT is designed to be a test you can't study for, and any test that you can't study for is the wrong kind of a test. You should have tests that practice will make perfect. You should be able to acquire the skill that you're expected to demonstrate. And so, yes, we should have more interesting tests, but other countries do. If you look at what the Canadians do and what the English do and what the French do in their examinations, they're much more imaginative tests than the ones that we've devised thus far.
Yeah, and one of our observations from the point of view of innovation theory has been that standards are actually tremendously propelling to innovation, because they tell you what you're shooting for. Standards are not to be mistaken for standardization, because what they say is there's multiple pathways to get to the objective, but they're at least clarifying where we're all going. And we've seen the same thing in countless fields where it's actually been uplifting. But because of the words, standards and standardization, that often gets conflated. Tom Vander Ark and I and a few others did an open letter on assessments that you can find on the insightsinstitute.org website, which I'd encourage people to take a look at, where we're encouraging the assessment consortia that are working Smarter, Balanced, and PARC, that are working with Common Core to develop this next generation of assessments, not to just create a test, but really to create a platform for innovation and assessment aligned to those standards that we want to see, so that people can develop and pass their skills and show proficiency in multiple ways as well, through projects, through essay questions, through a variety of paths, and have some believability, though, then of course that they were actually measuring what we want to see happen. So you do need to have that consistency. The other question that I think is interesting from your polling work, though, is how do we build this urgency around this? So you were talking about the, you're not seeing the urgency in places you thought. There's a lot of dialogue around race to the top, I3 and so forth from the federal government. There's been a lot of changes in states. It doesn't feel to me, though, that there's this urgency, and with digital learning tipping a little bit in your poll, how do you think about that?
Well, I think the good news is that this is not as politicized an issue as some of the other issues are in education, and I hope it doesn't become that way. I think the support within the teaching community for the idea of digital learning is something that can be capitalized on. I don't think the teacher unions are going to be as resistant to this as they have been to the school vouchers or even the charter schools. So technology is something Americans believe in. It's pretty hard to convince Americans that technology is somehow bad for them. I think the support level will continue to grow. I do think we shouldn't expect that public opinion is just going to turn on a dime overnight. When public opinion turns, it turns because of an event. And so if in fact, if we find some breakthrough technology, I don't know what it's going to be. Some people think the Khan Academy is the breakthrough. I don't know. But there's going to be some kind of a technological breakthrough that's going to be so persuasive. It's going to be so demonstrably better than what we've had that that I think is going to change public opinion pretty dramatically.
Terrific. Let's push through a few of these questions. We have a bunch of them sort of piling up everywhere. So one question comes back to the Common Core standards. If we push core standards nationally, we don't allow states to experiment and innovate them. Isn't online education supposed to be innovative? And don't we need to allow flexibility while seeking consensus and not turn online education into another bureaucratic push? How do you think about that tension?
Well, the question is where should the policy be set? Should we have federal policy for online learning for setting the standards and the rules of the game? Or because you can make a real argument for that. Nationwide markets, once you go online, you've got a nationwide market. So you should have regulation at the national level. That's going to be very controversial. We probably have to go to the state level. So we're going to have all these different states doing this, and there's going to be a lot of vested interests that are going to try to write those state regs in such a way as to protect those interests. I think it's going to be a challenge to get those policy systems right. And so working on some kind of model legislation that will try to create flexible systems that still have standards and still hold those who are producing the materials to some level of accountability. You've got to have the mix, and it's not an easy, there's no easy answer.
Great. The question says here, the U.S. teaches all children. No other nation teaches every child in their nation, so how can you compare other schools' performance to the top students of other nations? You actually talked about this briefly in your presentation, but can we go back to that and dig in a little bit more what's changed?
Every country in the world has high performers and low performers. There's no exception to that. The United States does a particularly bad job of teaching the low performers. We do not do as well as other countries do teaching the lowest performing students. Of the countries that have a well-developed education system. So the Finns, for example, not only have the best high-performing students, their low-performing students are closer to the higher-performing students than in the United States by a large margin. So you can have equality and higher quality at the same time. It's been done. And in fact, it's done quite regularly among the countries that have high performance. And I think the reason for that is they set up clear standards for everybody up and down the line.
So this is actually an interesting question that dovetails into competency-based learning, but also has the international angle to it, which is in the U.S., all students are tested based on the percentages of passing and so forth. Are all students tested in other countries on the percent passing, or do we see different ways of thinking about this data?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question because they have much more differentiated. The Koreans have it down to a fine. They got every little degree is of great significance. So I'm not saying we should necessarily go to that extreme, but most countries, it isn't just a matter of passing or not, it's a matter of how well you can do, and the better you can do, that'll show up on your transcript, and it'll affect your job prospects, and it'll affect what's going to happen to you later in life.
So I have to push you on the Korea question. There was an interesting op-ed in the Washington Post about a week or two ago, you may have seen it, about how their education attainment has just soared over the last couple of decades. The economy has been risen as well. And now they're graduating lots of students from college, and there are no jobs for them. It doesn't seem, the causal connection maybe doesn't seem to be there like we thought. Yet in this country, we're setting a goal of 2020, trying to get back on top of a degree graduation from college. How should we think about that?
The overeducated Korean. I wish we had that problem. Even with our current situation in the United States of 9% unemployment, there are still lots of jobs at the upper end that are going unfilled, and there's still a desperate need by corporate America for bringing in people from overseas because they do not perceive students in the United States as having the necessary, especially math skills. So we just are not generating the skill set that business is needing in this country. So, yeah, I hope we can have the problem the Koreans have. That would be great. Yeah, of course, the president of Korea came and talked to President Obama, and he said, you know, we have an education problem in Korea too. The parents there are absolutely insisting that their kids learn to speak English, and they should be taught not in second grade, but in first grade. Well, of course, when should you teach English if you're a Korean? You should start as early as possible. These parents in Korea have it right.
Once again, so we have a couple more minutes left before we break and go back into some a really interesting day of sessions. Question for you is: do you feel that pre-service teachers will be prepared adequately with the with the advent of course standards, and will the current teachers have the appropriate training for these new environments, for this digital learning?
Well, I think it's going to have a dramatic effect on the teaching profession if we introduce digital learning at scale. But the good news in that regard is that the presentation of the material can be done consistently by those who are really knowledgeable, and the classroom teacher can benefit from this professional expertise being made available to them, as well as the student, and the teacher can become a coach. So I'm not so sure that this is going to impose a heavy new burden on the teaching profession. It may actually make teaching easier. It should make teaching easier.
Yeah, in fact, I would say that for it to work, it has to be that, because otherwise, if you're just layering on what's already a pretty Superman-esque job, that's probably a non-starter in any system. A couple questions, just really briefly for both of us. Someone asked the website that I highlighted, where the market map that I showed. It's at the New Schools Venture Fund website, and it's right on the front there. You click on the EdTech market map. You can also get to it from InnosightInstitute.org or from Education Elements website. There's all links that go to the New Schools Venture Fund site there. And then the last question being that, can our PowerPoints be placed on the wiki?
I suppose. I think that's not going to be a problem.
Terrific. Mine as well. Can you please all join me in thanking Paul Peterson for this? And so we're free to break now. The next session started about 15 minutes, I believe, and go through